Chag Sameach. Today's Torah reading took us through the entire calendar year of Jewish holidays. It's helpful because it puts Sukkot in the agricultural context in which it was originally celebrated. We started with Shabbat, the most important holiday, and then we had the beginning of the biblical calendar with Passover, not just the holiday of our freedom, but also the unofficial kickoff to spring, and thus the farming year. We went through the Omer, through Shavuot, the picking of the first fruits at the beginning of summer. Now, after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have arrived at the finish line of Sukkot. Many of our holidays have multiple different names. Sukkot is no exception. It's also called Chag HaAsif, the festival of ingathering, because this is when all the crops would be harvested and collected to be used or stored for the winter. And it's also so important that is sometimes called Hechag, the holiday. In the time of the temple, Sukkot was a time of great joy, Zman Simchatenu, but also a time of great trepidation, because the fate of the people, their ability to last through the winter, would be determined by the success or failure of that year's harvest. And next year's harvest, and therefore next year's fate, would be determined by how much rain would fall in the upcoming winter. And those factors in turn were all bound up by the success or failure of that year's sacrifices and prayers leading up to Sukkot and on Sukkot itself. Although the section of the Torah we read today does state that sacrifices should be offered on Sukkot, it doesn't go into the specifics. It's elsewhere in the book of Numbers that the Torah actually lays out what those sacrifices should be. First day of Sukkot, 1 goat, 14 lambs, 2 rams, 13 bulls. Second day, also 1 goat, 14 lambs, 2 rams, but this time only 12 bulls instead of 13. And on the third day, 11 bulls instead of 12. On each of the 7 days of Sukkot, the number of bulls sacrificed decreases by 1, even as all the other sacrifices remained constant. The Torah itself doesn't explain why this changed each day of Sukkot, but the rabbis understood that the change of this part of the sacrifices from one day of Sukkot to the next, even as the rest stayed constant, meant that something significant must be going on here. In fact, the rabbis quickly figured out that the total number of bulls throughout Sukkot, when you add all of them up from each day, adds up to 70. The number 70 was significant throughout the ancient Near East. Archaeologists researching the ancient city of Emar, a Hittite community in what is now Syria, found evidence that they also celebrated a 7-day holiday complete with sacrifices. One ancient document from Emar describes their holiday as follows. On the month of the head of the year, on the 14th day, they offer 70 pure lambs provided by the king for all the 70 gods of Emar. Sounds kind of familiar, right? One of the best ways to understand the customs of the ancient Israelites is to think about the ways that they did and didn't want to differentiate themselves from their neighbors. For all of the very real revolutions that Jewish law had towards subjects like slavery and divorce in their contemporary context, the worship, Israelite worship, couldn't be too distinctive from the Akkadians or the Assyrians, because individual Israelites with less secure attachment to the God of Israel might get a wandering eye, so to speak, if they thought that they were part of a religion that was wildly different from all of their more powerful neighbors. As Maimonides later explained, God instituted the sacrifices as a stepping stone to help people who only understood that the only way that they could connect with God was through a sacrificial system, because that was how things went at the time for every people around them. Even so, within the sacrificial system, although there were many similarities between Israelites and their neighbors, it was the small distinctions that actually made the big differences. So yes, both the Israelites and the Emorites offered 70 sacrifices shortly after Rosh Hashanah, but the Emorites offered them to 70 gods, which obviously the monotheistic Israelites did not do. So what importance did the Israelites attach to that number? Ancient Israelites believed that there were 70 nations in the world. That number goes back to the genealogy section of the book of Genesis, where the 3 sons of Noah, who by virtue of surviving the flood, they're the ancestors, they're the patriarchs of all humanity, they're listed as having begat 70 different nations. And so therefore, as Rabbi Elazar explained in the Talmud, the 70 bulls that were sacrificed on Sukkot correspond to the 70 nations of the world. And the idea was expanded upon in the Midrash and by Rashi, that the sacrifices of the 70 bulls are on behalf of the 70 nations, so that the rain would fall for them too, so that the world would not be bereft of them. When we pray for rain, we're not praying that the rain falls only on Jewish farms. We're praying for everyone's well-being. As beloved as we are by God, as God's chosen people, we're also just one of the world's 70 nations, each of whom deserves sustenance as well. It's pretty astonishing if you think about the fraught history of relations between Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors, that one of the core rituals of Sukkot, of Hechag, of the holiday, was to pray for the welfare of the Gentiles. But I think it's fitting that this prayer for the general welfare took place on Sukkot, because each of the Jewish holidays sits somewhere on the spectrum between Jewish particularism on one hand and universalism on the other hand. Passover, at the beginning of the agricultural year, is obviously a very particular Jewish story about Jewish slaves who were freed by the outstretched hand of the God of Israel in order to be able to practice Judaism freely. Very Jewish story. But the Israelites also left with the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude of non-Jewish escapees. The Haggadah's celebrations of freedom come paired with reminders that it's our obligation to ensure freedom for all and to say, let all who are hungry come and eat. Sukkot, if anything, seems even more particularly Jewish, if not peculiarly Jewish, with our odd huts and the shaking of strange vegetation. But recalling the Sukkot sacrifices reminds us that it's our obligation to pray for and ultimately work to ensure the welfare of all who dwell on earth, not just those in our Jewish community. Jewish thought and ethics are clear that it is absolutely acceptable to prioritize Jewish charities when giving tzedakah, or for that matter, to prioritize Jewish concerns among the many issues that face our society. But the lesson of the Sukkot sacrifices is that our actions should never be done at the expense of our non-Jewish neighbors. We have to have their welfare in mind as well. Something that is good for the Jews, but bad for everyone else, is not good for the Jews at all. Even in times when tensions between Jews and non-Jews, or Jews and some non-Jews, are running high, we hold out hope that reconciliation and mutual support is possible. The prophecy of Zechariah we read for our Haftorah today is a good example of it. Much of it reads like a revenge fantasy against all the enemies of the Jewish people, with plague, panic, and ruin afflicting those who took up arms against us. But then comes a verse that carries with it a note of hope. All who survive of all these nations that came up against Jerusalem shall make a pilgrimage year by year to bow low to Melech Adonai Tzvaot and to observe Chag HaSukkot. One can assume that this is some sort of humiliation ritual, a conquered people imagining that the conquerors will one day have to supplicate themselves to us. But that's not how the rabbis understand it. Radak, the medieval commentator, explains that these other nations coming to Jerusalem will be people who have done true tshuva and have returned to God and God's ways with all their hearts. And their reward will be celebrating Sukkot in the rebuilt temple alongside us. The true dream of the world to come, the prophet Zechariah says, is when all nations celebrate Sukkot together, Gentiles standing alongside the Jewish people, and Jews praying that Gentiles are sustained and supported by God and by us as well. We no longer have a temple, and the world of peace and reconciliation seen in Zechariah's prophecy may seem a long way away. But we can work towards creating that world on this first day of Sukkot and in the days and years ahead. Chag Sameach.
Thank you for joining the Park Avenue Synagogue family. I hope you enjoyed the sermon. Please consider supporting our online community by scanning the QR code or by going to supportpas.org. or by making a donation. Shalom, and see you in Shul.